All right, today we are jumping into one of the most intense, mind-altering, and honestly important periods in all of philosophy, German Idealism. Now, I know what you might be thinking, but this is not some dusty old topic. This was a 50-year intellectual firestorm where four incredible thinkers went head-to-head with the biggest questions you can think of. What is reality? How can we know anything for sure? And what does it really mean to be free? So stick around, because we're about to see how they didn't just try to understand reality, they tried to reinvent it from the ground up.
So to really get why this was such a revolution, we first have to understand the crisis that sparked it. The 18th century Enlightenment, the age of reason, had made this big promise that we could use logic and science to figure everything out. But the problem was, by the end of the century, reason had kind of reasoned itself into a dead end, staring down a problem so big it threatened to tear down everything they thought they knew.
And that problem, that crisis, really boils down to this one simple question. There was this Scottish philosopher, David Hume, who basically launched a missile at our most fundamental beliefs. He argued that when you see one billiard ball hit another, you don't actually see a thing called causality. Nope, you just see one event followed by another, and your mind just gets used to it. For Hume, these big ideas like cause and effect weren't really in the world at all. They were just habits of our mind. And this, as you can imagine, threw the entire search for certain knowledge into total chaos.
Now, Hume's attack just blew up the whole philosophical landscape, which was pretty much split into two major teams. On one side, you had the rationalists, who said real knowledge comes from pure reason, kind of like geometry. On the other, you had the empiricists, who argued that nope, all knowledge has to come from what we see, hear, and touch. Hume, being an empiricist, just took that idea to its absolute limit and showed that if you only rely on experience, you can't actually prove things like causality, or even that you have a consistent self. Philosophy was completely stuck.
So, to get out of this jam, we're going to follow what I like to call a philosophical relay race. It all starts with one giant who tries to solve Hume's problem, but in doing so, he creates a totally new one. Then he passes the baton to the next thinker, who solves that problem, but, you guessed it, creates another one in the process. This agenda right here, that's our track map for this incredible race of ideas.
And the first runner, the guy who basically lights the fuse for this whole explosion, is Immanuel Kant. He read Hume's work and famously said it woke him from his dogmatic slumber. He realized you couldn't just patch up the old systems. To save philosophy, he needed a full-blown revolution.
And just check out this timeline. This entire philosophical universe just erupts and evolves in the span of 50 years. That's it. From Kant's groundbreaking book in 1781 to Hegel's death in 1831, these guys were writing, arguing, and building on each other's work in real time. So this wasn't just a relay race, it was more like a high-speed, full-contact sport for the mind. Okay, so Kant's first big move was to get really clear about what we mean by knowledge. Hume basically saw two types. But Kant makes this absolutely critical distinction. On one hand, you have a posteriori knowledge, stuff you know after an experience, like the sky is blue, because, well, you've seen it. On the other hand, there's a priori knowledge, stuff you know before any experience, like all bachelors are unmarried. That's true just by definition. Kant's stroke of genius was to say there's a secret third category Hume missed, knowledge that's absolutely universal, like causality, but that isn't just a simple definition. So here it is, the big one. Kant called it his Copernican revolution in philosophy. For centuries, he said, we've just assumed that our minds have to conform to the world of objects. But what if, he asked, it's the other way around? What if objects have to conform to our minds? He argued that your mind isn't some passive camera just recording things. No, it's an active processor. It takes the raw, chaotic data from your senses and automatically stamps it with its own built-in structures, these categories like causality, substance, unity. It's kind of like we're all born wearing a pair of reality-organizing glasses and we can't ever take them off.
But here's the massive catch. Kant saved our knowledge of the world as we experience it. He called this the world of phenomena. But in doing so, he built this giant wall between us and the world as it actually is, in itself. He called that the thing in itself, or the Noumena. We can be sure it's there, but we can never know what it's like because we're always looking at it through our mental glasses. And with that giant, frustrating wall, Kant passes the baton.
So who grabs the baton? A guy named Johann Gottlieb Fichte. He was a brilliant and pretty fiery follower of Kant. But he looked at that wall Kant built,
that barrier between our minds and the thing in itself, and he just found it completely unacceptable. He decided the only way forward was to just tear the whole thing down.
And this quote right here, from another philosopher at the time, really gets at the pressure Fichte was feeling. Critics were saying that Kant's big idea, this transcendental idealism, was just going to leave everyone feeling cut off from reality, that it leads to nihilism. Fichte heard that challenge, and his response was basically to say, "You think that's idealistic? I'll show you idealism." He decided to double down and go even more radical.
So how do you get rid of that mysterious, unknowable world? Fichte's solution was just breathtakingly bold. He said, forget about a world that exists outside of us. Let's start with just one single absolute thing, the self-creating I. First, the I just asserts its own existence. It posits itself. But to be aware of itself, it needs something to bump up against. So the I then posits a not I, that's the external world, as a kind of challenge, an obstacle. And it's in this constant struggle, this back and forth, that everything we call consciousness and freedom is actually born. Just like that, the mysterious thing in itself is gone.
But as you can probably guess by now, Fichte's solution creates a whole new headache. If everything comes from the activity of the self, then what does that make nature? Is the entire majestic, complex natural world just a prop? Is it just a cosmic sparring partner for our own self-development? A kind of illusion we set up just to overcome it? That started to feel pretty wrong. And so the baton gets passed again. Our next runner is Friedrich Schelling. Now, Schelling started out as a huge fan of Fichte, but he became more and more unhappy with his teacher's view of nature. He thought it was demeaning, and he decided philosophy had to take a major turn.
And the shift here is just huge. You see, Fichte saw this act of self making a pass of nature for it to conquer. Schelling said, no, that's totally wrong. He argued that nature and the self, or spirit, aren't opposed. They're two sides of the very same coin. They're both equally powerful expressions of one single unified reality that he called the absolute. And he put it in this really beautiful way. Nature is visible spirit, and spirit is invisible nature. He gave nature its soul back, seeing it not as a dead thing, but as a living, intelligent, creative force.
Now, Schelling's vision was incredibly poetic and powerful, but it left a giant philosophical question just hanging in the air. Okay, fine. Nature and spirit are two poles of the same absolute, but how does that actually work? How do they connect? How do you get from a rock to a thought in one single logical system? Schelling had pointed out the two ends of the bridge, but he hadn't quite built the bridge itself. For that job, he'd have to pass the baton to his old college roommate and his greatest rival. And that brings us to the last runner, the great synthesizer, the grand finale of German idealism, Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. Hegel looked at all the loose ends left by Kant, Fichte, and Schelling, and he gave himself the absolutely monumental task of tying it all together into one giant, all-encompassing system of thought. See, for Hegel, reality wasn't a static object we just look at. It was a process. It was a living, rational unfolding that he called spirit, or Geist. And the engine that drives this entire cosmic process forward, he called it the dialectic. The key idea here is that contradiction and conflict aren't mistakes. They're actually the very things that push thought and history and all of reality to a higher and higher level of truth.
The dialectics moves in this constant three-step rhythm. You can think of it like a really good argument. You start with a thesis, an initial statement or position. Well, that statement almost always brings up its opposite, an antithesis, which challenges or negates it. But the process doesn't just stop there in a standoff. The conflict gets resolved in a synthesis, a new, richer, more complex idea that keeps the truth from both sides but moves beyond them. And then, of course, that synthesis becomes the new thesis, and the whole process starts over again, on a higher level.
Let's look at Hegel's most famous example of this in action, the master-slave dialectic. So you have two people who fight for recognition. The master wins and seems to be the independent one, while the slave is dependent. That's our thesis. But then comes the antithesis, the twist. The master just consumes and does nothing, so he becomes totally dependent on the slave's work. Meanwhile, the slave, by working on the world and changing it, develops skills and a real sense of self. And the synthesis? In a shocking reversal, it's the slave who achieves a truer, more real form of independence and self-consciousness. It's through that struggle that consciousness grows up.
Okay, so after that wild race through four of the most challenging minds in history, you might be sitting there thinking,
Why does any of this hyper-abstract stuff still matter today? The answer is, it's pretty much everywhere you look.
The ideas that exploded during this 50-year period really did set the stage for the modern world. Karl Marx famously grabbed Hegel's Dialectic and flipped it on its head to talk about class struggle. Existentialism, with Kierkegaard, was basically a rebellion against Hegel's giant impersonal system. Entire schools of thought like phenomenology and critical theory come directly from this lineage. Even modern psychology, with its focus on the self, owes a huge debt to these thinkers. You can't really understand modern thought without them.
And that really brings us to the heart of it all. From Kant's mind structuring our experience to Hegel's spirit unfolding through history, the central, radical idea of German idealism is that our consciousness isn't just a passive mirror reflecting the world, it's an active player in creating it. And that leaves us with one last massive question, a question that's just as urgent today as it was 200 years ago. If our minds really do play a role in shaping reality, then what kind of reality are we choosing to create?